I've only fairly recently properly returned to my work on graffiti. It's been quite a stop-start project for various reasons. So I found the seminar series really, really useful for reconnecting. As Ilaria said, the project, which is in collaboration with the French Egyptian Centre at Karnak, whose logo is on the slide, is undertaken with Chiara Salvador, who is my co-director. And she and I are currently deeply embedded in the Temple of Qatar in Karnak, which you will get to know a lot better shortly, maybe more than you want to know, because we're so obsessed with some of this material. But that's what our sort of current focus is. And so that's where I will probably spend a lot of this time in the seminar. Chiara, thank you for being here. Chiara has very kindly offered to help out with questions at the end of this presentation. So it'll be a bit of a team opportunity for team discussion at the end. So the quotation in the talk's title is taken from a book entitled Wall Talk, Graffiti of the Egyptian Revolution, specifically from an essay or poem by Rasha Azab. She describes the multiple perceptions and agencies of walls as deaf and pitiless, which stop even time in its tracks. But then she says that we've seen other walls. We've seen their potentials as spaces for colour, joy, protection, and of course, protest. I'm taking her quotation out of context, of course, relating it to completely different material. But it got me, as I was sort of reading her essay or poem and looking at some of this material, it got me questioning my sort of blanket or overarching understanding of how our temple walls are conceptualized, how they might be seen, and how graffiti as a practice on these walls is potentially more unstable and more disruptive than I had been thinking. And I thought I would use the example of Erasure as a way of exploring this because it keeps it quite sort of tightly focused. The photograph that you can see is of an erased graffito. It's someone's name and title. And for those of you that are not familiar with the Egyptian script here, you've got this, what looks like a capital or a big N in the English alphabet is actually the title scribe. So it's in Egyptian Zesh and the title scribe. His name would have been here, but it is completely and thoroughly erased. The signs are quite large, almost 10 centimeters in height. So it's a big graffito. And if we move to this picture, this photograph, if your screen is not covered up by pictures or Zoom boxes, the graffito, you might be able to just see it up on this block here. So it's well above sort of eye level. The ancient ground level is roughly where we are standing in this photograph. So, so you get a sense of the position of the graffito and how high it is, how visible it might have been if you knew where to look. This wall is one of our major areas of work and one of the densest clusters of textual graffiti that we have in our study range. This wall has many stories to tell, and I'll come back to it and this graffito a little bit later. This photograph also sort of introduces Chiara, who's standing, this is me here, and Chiara is standing next to me here, and our photographer, Ellie Jones. And I think this photograph really captures the process of work for Chiara and I, standing, puzzling, is that a graffito? Can you see that? Do you see that? I don't see that. This is what we spend a lot of our time doing. Whose wall was this? what might be the perceptions of walls like this, especially those in the temple that bear only graffiti? Is it appropriate to frame questions like this in terms of ownership and territory? Graffiti seem to us in the modern world so territorial, and we often frame the study of ancient graffiti in the same terms. Is this appropriate, or should we be trying to tell other stories about the wall, about the act of inscription, and about the act of erasure? I want to give you a sense of the overall kind of shape of the seminar, just so you know where I'm headed and the overall structure. So I'm going to start out with an introduction to Karnak, which you can see beautifully depicted in this photograph here. We're looking down the southern axis to the central axis with the sacred lake here. I have to say, pictures like this make me long for travel. It's been a long time since I've been in Egypt. So after I've given a general introduction to Karnak and graffiti practice, I'll turn to just a couple of examples of graffiti and erasures on this southern axis route. And then I'm going to go back to the Temple of Qatar and get into some micro stories where we're really sort of analyzing the micro stratigraphy of walls to think about inscription and erasure and relative chronologies of that. And then I'll come out to some very quick final thoughts about how we might think about all of this. I'm going to end up asking more questions than I answer, and that's, I think, entirely appropriate. Because I'm here to get your thoughts and to get your ideas and to see if I can shake up my thinking about this material a bit more. So, just an introduction to where we are in Egypt. So, Karnak Temple is in the ancient city of Thebes in the south of Egypt. So here in the modern city of Luxor. And the Amun complex, you can see this large walled complex laid out here, and it has subsidiary complexes to other deities on either side. And of course, you can see it's on the east bank of the Nile, and the west bank, there's other conglomerations of temples and tombs on the west bank as well. So it's a very it's one of the most productive archaeological sites for those of you that are not familiar with Egyptian material. The Temple of Amun at Karnak was one of the premier temple environments of ancient Egypt, and it spans more than 2,000 years of activity. In this map, I've kind of flipped it around, so you have to imagine that the Nile is now this way, just so we can think about the temple in terms of access routes and spatial arrangements. So the Temple of Qatar, where I started, is a subsidiary temple out here. It's in the later enclosure wall, the 30th dynasty enclosure wall, but for much of its history and much of its kind of use life, this little temple would have had its own enclosure wall and been outside the main Amun precinct. So that's where I started work on graffiti, was in the Temple of Qatar. We've also extended our work to the southern processional route. So Chiara's project, and I'm going to talk about some of her work, was centered around here, although she also has another project working out here, and she has done a lot of work to consider the whole of the southern processional route. And the 8th pylon here is the other kind of main area of focus for me and for the Karnak Graffiti project. So we have these sort of two large areas with an additional kind of set of focus areas in the southern processional route. The main sanctuary of the temple, the Holy of Holies, would have been in this area here, and this is the main axial route, processional route through to that space, but the southern axis was also another processional route, another really important processional route. I've done some preliminary work on graffiti in the central axis, but and I'm hoping to come back to that, but that hasn't been our focus area for a little while. Really important additional temple is the Temple of Konsu, the god Konsu, another one of these subsidiary temples out here. There's been a major publication of graffiti from this temple by Jacques Gordon, which is sort of one of our constant reference points in our project. And further graffiti from the Temple of Konsu is being studied by Ahmed El-Tahar, who also collaborates with us on our projects, and we're really lucky to be able to work so closely with him. For our material, our graffiti is produced during the time when the temple is a functioning temple. It is a state-sponsored functioning temple, and the graffiti that is being produced comes out of this activity. So just to be very clear about that, it's not after the temple has changed function in any major way. This slide just gives you a sense, I hope, of the range of what we have. So most of our material, as is the case for the majority of Egyptian temples, most graffiti is pictorial. So you have this little bark here, a figure of a god, believe it or not, here, maybe some sort of vessel, lots of animals, although that might be a sphinx. And these particular examples are all late. They're all Ptolemaic or Roman in date. So although the figural material, pictorial material comes under our sort of project duties and responsibilities, we also are responsible for categories of textual graffiti in the temple. This can be both hieroglyphic and hieratic. Demotic material is being worked on by Ghislaine Vidmer. So the graffito on this side of the screen here shows an example of one of our longest and most elaborate hieratic graffiti. So hieratic is the cursive form of the script that is in use until about the mid-first millennium BC. And again, I hope you can recognize that kind of N sign, the scribe sign again. So we have a scribe and his name here in a very elaborate setting, which unfortunately we've lost the top of, but it's a very elaborate setting. And this is just another example from nearby of another hieratic graffito. Hieroglyphic graffiti are actually rather rare, and I will show you some examples of those later. Most of the texts that we have that come under our responsibility in the project are hieratic. And this is a really quite beautiful example. You can see these elegantly carved titles and names, title and name here. And I'm sure at this point you've noticed that all these graffiti that I've shown you so far are carved or incised. Someone with a sharp flint or metal tool carves into the soft, grainy sandstone of the temple wall. And notice how the graffiti capture shadows. We have to pay attention to the quality of the line and light. In some lights, in some places, graffiti are rendered almost invisible. Most walls would have been plastered white, as here, so they are cutting through that surface, and we have the remains of this plastered surface here. This has implications for seeing and how they were seen. The Hierarchic Script is used for papyrus and ostraca, for letters, administrative documents, and poems. It's actually very rare on stone. And as Chloe Ragazzoli has discussed in relation to ink graffiti, the scribes have invented a monumental form of hieratic, conjuring up the world of manuscripts in an epigraphic context. It's exactly what we have here. We do have ink and paint, but it is very rare. And this is just gives you a couple of examples of this from different places in Karnak. Although the image here looks like it's in black ink, that's just because the photograph has been run through the de-stretch plugin, so we could actually read the inscription. It's very faint yellow paint that the de-stretch allowed us to start to read. This material reminds us what we have lost, that ink, paint simply doesn't survive well or at all on exposed surfaces, and we always have to bear that in mind. So stepping back out, this scene from a tomb over on the West Bank is quite nice for thinking about perceptions of temple space. It shows a temple entrance here, although I have to stress that this is not Karnak, it's a temple on the West Bank, but it illustrates my point quite nicely. The temple here is closed, the door is closed, and the people mediating access, even for the gods or the goddess arriving here, are the priests. Over life size in this representation, you know, these kind of human representations of human authority are given prominence in this scene, as they should in the tomb of a priest of this temple called Amun Moses. So you can see him, his self-display relates to this idea of having authority and having access and mediating access. The graffiti that we record is largely that of temple staff. So all the titles in the graffiti that you've seen so far are those of scribes, administrative staff, and we have other graffiti of priests. The graffiti is not that of visitors, pilgrims, or members of some sort of congregation in any sense. I've certainly argued, especially in relation to the more formal material that we have, that graffiti production is co-opted into priestly and scribal self-presentation as one strategy for claims to devotion, of course, but also agency and authority. So it seems legitimate, sanctioned, even sometimes commissioned. It's a self or group affirming practice, self-governed at particular times and places. Or is it? The qualification particular times or particular places is crucial here. And looking at erasure is one way to push at this, to test and to diversify, contextualize a little bit more our interpretations. So I'm going to start here in Chiara's place, actually, which is the court of the seventh pylon. We're just in here. And in the photograph, we're standing here looking towards this pylon, this massive pylon gateway here, and the colossal statuary in front of it. This photograph shows an empty space. It gives you a feeling for the space, but a very partial one. This courtyard would have probably been cluttered with statues and other monuments. For much of the time, it would have been a building site, as different kings commissioned decorations, statues, and structures. And what about people? We have to kind of re-people it with the temple staff as well. Our nice, clean plans and photographs are so deceptive, stopping even time in its tracks, to quote Azab again. Graffiti open up the dynamism of temple space. And I want to give you a sense of this by looking to the west wall of this court. So we're going to turn our heads and look to the west wall of the court here, to this wall. These massive holes in the wall, I have to say immediately, are very, very late. They were created when an obelisk was being moved through this space for transport by Emperor Constantine between 330 and 337 AD, so very late indeed. The primary decoration, which I hope you can see here, consists of images of the king, in this case, either Ramses II or Meneptah, performing rituals or offerings before figures of the gods. And these are repeated image types across the wall. These scenes were created, as I said, by Ramses II or his successor, so around 1280 to 1204 BC. This band of hieroglyphic inscription here with royal names and cartouches was carved about 100 years later under the reign of Ramses IV. So we have the ultimate authority here, the king and the gods, and traditional decorative programs of temples are almost entirely restricted to depicting aspects of that relationship. And here, of course, remember we're in an interior space, close to the central area, the central axis of the temple. But we have graffiti here. In this area, in this lower part, where you can reach just by kind of sitting and leaning on the wall, we have scattered groups of graffiti. And here I'm really drawing on Chiara's work. So thank you, Chiara, for this. This plan by Chiara shows one area of this in different phases of graffiti practice. The green indicates what she has analysed as, and I think very convincingly analysed as, the first phase of graffiti, where you have names and titles. You might be able to just see them here, traces of them in this area, kind of carved below the primary inscriptions, or the primary scenes, I should say, of the king and the gods. They seem very respectful of the scenes themselves. So they were probably carved after the scenes were in place, and sort of pay respect to those scenes. They don't kind of cross into the scenes themselves. But they are almost completely destroyed or overlaid by the Ramses IV text that runs along here, his inscription. So we have nice temporal boundaries for this material, post Ramses II, but before Ramses IV, period of about 100 years. And this material for the main is quite lightly incised, and you might be able to see that in this photograph here, these sort of traces of lightly incised graffiti. Again, it's the sort of graffiti that you only see in certain lights, although perhaps it was more visible when if this area was plastered and it was carved into plaster, but still, it's quite lightly incised. The fact that it was almost entirely removed by the royal inscription means we have the sense that this was once their space, once a graffiti space, but not anymore. I want to zoom in quickly to look at the guy that Chiara indicates in blue here. This is a man named Ashaket, and we've got 2, possibly 3 graffiti belonging to this guy. We're going to start with the first one down here, and you can barely see it. It's in this space here. This is the lowest inscription, and it may have been the first one of his inscribed, and it was thoroughly and systematically erased. He carved his name very deeply though, so part of his name, the circular sign here and the one below, are almost impossible to remove unless they were filled in with plaster later. Then, so this is this inscription here, then up in the marginal inscription here, we have his name. So his name is written with a lizard sign, little lizard. You might be able to just make out the kind of curve of the lizard shape here. And there's that really deep round sign. So we have his name here, Ashaket. And up here, we may have the lizard again. So it looks like he perhaps started to carve his name here, changed his mind, and then carved it here. And then it was cut through by the Ramses IV inscription, so it must predate that inscription. This guy, Ashaket, might hold the title of God's father, which is quite high ranking. If that's right, then he is someone who was initiated, able to access the cult statues of the gods. So he's not an insignificant person. So what's happening here? And there are many possible ways to understand this, but I'll tell the story that Chiara leaned towards after careful assessment. So Ashiket inscribes his name here when this area was a graffiti space before the royal text. It got erased. By whom? Temple authorities? But isn't he a member of that group? Can we describe the erasure as a criticism? Perhaps it was too deep and too big. In that case, can we understand his recarving as a resistant response, almost a protest? No matter what, no matter how we come at this, and maybe that's something for discussion at the end, the depth and resilience of the carving speaks to an awareness of the contingencies of writing here, writing anywhere, and it's almost pushing back at that. I'm going to move now to another set of examples where motivations might be a little bit starker. And I'm moving here out of primary areas, sort of interior spaces, out to more marginal spaces, areas that belong to priestly and administrative groups to some extent. And we can question this discussion of belonging at the end. So here we're at the 8th pylon, looking out towards the sacred lake. And this is coming back the other way, the sacred lake behind us, this surface here, a doorway leading into the pylon here. Oops, wrong arrow. So this arrow should be just here, just indicating where we are on the plan. There is very little here that we would characterize as primary decoration. We have sets of very formal inscriptions belonging to high priests, so the ultimate temple authority outside of the kind of larger authorities of the king. And these priests date to the late 2nd millennium BC. This is the set of inscriptions belonging to one of these priests here and here. You do have a royal inscription here, probably commissioned by the priest, I think. These are not graffiti, these inscriptions, but they do not fit within traditional frameworks of temple display. The high priest, Roma, stands here, but look at the sun, the figure of the sun behind him. Look at the damage to the face, to the hands, and his name has also been damaged, quite extensively excised here. But Roma himself, his figure is undamaged. We know that Roma's son did not inherit his office, and he is otherwise unattested in the record. Let's enter into the staircase. So we're going through the doorway that you can see here. And there you can see a pretty old photograph of me right at the top of the stairs. So the stairs lead up to some sort of watch post at the top of the pylon gateway, looking out over the processional route. And we have very interesting graffiti in this space. These are bare, finished, so worked, but untreated walls. And I feel in here, we are very much in between, in a marginal space, hidden away. Inscribed at the top and the bottom of the stairs are these little kind of stele-like presentations, hieroglyphic with very formal depictions of individuals. These are scenes and texts of temple staff, considered piety graffiti, although you would be justified in questioning that. They are certainly ex-photos, modeled on formal styles of self-presentation. And these guys are members of Roma's staff. That high priest out the front, these are the guys that worked for him. They even include one of his names, or this guy includes one of his names, the high priest's names in his inscription. But note again, the damage to the face and the damage to the arms, not the hands this time, but the arms. So taking away his breath and his capacity for action. His name and the name of the artist, though, are untouched. On the other side, where I'm kind of looking up to this inscription in the photograph, is this guy. He's a baker of, or he's a producer of baked goods, a baker, and again, a member of the temple staff. And again, his face is removed and his hands are damaged. And actually, interestingly, although his name remains, the name of his artist, the artist seems to have been thoroughly hacked out. And in another one of the scenes, we have something like this, where the dedicator is damaged and the name of the artist is taken out. It's easier to tell political stories here, stories of factions, probably a power grab after the high priest's death, and his family loses. Members of his staff are perhaps tarred by association, but the scenes are not erased. Perhaps this is enough, or more than enough. These walls were yours, but they are no longer. And other people will know it. The other people that use this space will know it. Factions and disputes, of course, are part of institutional life. We all know this. And just to kind of step out into the wider context again, we have, I'm quoting here from a decree that was set up by the king contemporaneous with Roma and his staff. It's very damaged, but part of this decree, which is massive, huge carved decree, set up back in the court of the 7th pylon, part of this decree is directed to temple staff. It says, his person decreed that a command be given to the bearers of Amun, to the gods' fathers, to the pure priests, to the lector priests, that no bribe should be allowed to be required from any of them by a god's father. And as for any god's father of whom it is heard that he requires a bribe from them, he will be expelled from his post and reduced to a field laborer. So this is all part of temple life. And here we have it explicitly acknowledged in a royal text. Bribery, corruption, quid pro quo that the cartoon here is alluding to. All of this shakes up the abstracted vision of serene piety and service that we tend to fall for in our interpretations of temple space. This is, of course, a complicated, riven world, and graffiti and sources like this decree open that up to us and problematize this, make this all a little bit more contingent and unstable. So for the last part of this seminar, and I'll just check countdown for time, I want to move to the Temple of Qatar, right out here in the north of the complex. As I said, the temple's now up against the first millennium BC enclosure wall, but for most of its history, it stood outside the main enclosure and would have had its own enclosure wall. There's lots of graffiti in this temple, from on the gates and on every side. So the gates here and on every side, and the kind of front kind of facade area as well. But most of it is pictorial, and most of it's quite late. We do have some demotic material here, which Ghislaine is working on, and that is concentrated on the gates. Where we are working, where Chiara and I are currently deeply obsessed and embedded, is the south wall here. And the graffiti on this wall is very, very different. This is a densely discursive space. We have something like 200 graffiti events here, mostly textural, mostly hieratic inscriptions, but we also have some more complex scenes and a little bit of pictorial, isolated pictorial material. Why here? it must be something to do with visibility, I think. Visibility in relation to what's going on more centrally, or visibility in relation to activities within the temple's own enclosure wall. And I'm happy to discuss, Chiara and I are happy to discuss what we think might be going on here a bit more at the end, if you like. There's lots of erasures on this wall of different types. Every time we look at a block now, we're starting to see erasure and palimpsest. So I'm only going to look at a couple of examples just to give you a sense of that. So I'm going to start up on these high blocks, blocks numbered 1, 2, and 3 on our plan, or actually just 1 and 2 on our plan. This is where Ali is here, photographing these blocks, just to give you a sense of the scale. And these, of course, should be a little bit familiar because these are the examples that I began with. We have this inscription of the scribe Prenacht with his mum and his dad, and a date. So maybe he's witnessing something that he's seeing out in the main temple complex. These graffiti are extravagantly carved. There's even an ashaket here. So there's the scribe and there's the lizard, beautifully carved here, and then that deep circular sign. It's more lightly inscribed here. And I have to say, this is probably not the same person. This is a different ashaket, probably almost certainly at a different time. But just gives you a sense of the kind of the scale of these graffiti. And here's that beautiful calligraphic graffito that I started out with as well. Note the creamy colored surface of the blocks here. Here, areas of the plastered surface that people were cutting into survive. This is really unusual for us. And this creamy white, now yellowish pattern that would have covered the whole of the wall, but we only have it in 1 or 2 places. And this is a really, really nice example of it. You can get a sense just how much more visible these graffiti are because of this plastering. There is an odd one out in this cluster, and you may have noticed it already, one that's not perhaps quite as beautiful, although I realize that my idea of beauty and graffiti is a bit weird and warped, so maybe you don't see any of this as beautiful. So what we have is this inscription here, and just zooming in a little bit, we have very deeply carved framing lines for an inscription, very similar to the one of Prenacht and his folks. But you might just be able to make out here traces of inscriptions. So we have that scribe title again here. His name will continue here, but that currently eludes us. We haven't got a reading for that yet. The rest of the text is covered in plaster. It continues under the plaster here, and you can see how the plaster is caught in the line, the framing line here. This seems to be an instance of a graffito being plastered over very soon after its creation. And we know of other examples of this in other temples. So perhaps it's enough just to be there. Perhaps this is a devotional act, a way of being present, and it's enough just to be there, and then it gets plastered. At the moment, we tend to think this is probably the first graffito in this area because of this plastering. So this one was probably first, then the walls were plastered, and then other graffiti writers came. Perhaps this guy came back and wrote again. It's like, damn it, got my timing wrong. But this is quite an interesting example, one of the few examples where we can really think about graffiti in relationship to the act of plastering, just because we have the plastered surface surviving here. Slightly lower and further along the wall, so block number 4 on our plan, is the guy I started with. This guy here. This is the only graffito on the block, as far as we know, as far as we've been able to identify. And the graffito looks kind of singular. It sort of stands out by itself. Now, we don't have the continuation of the blocks this way, and we don't have the blocks above, so we have to be a bit cautious with this. We also don't have the plastered surface, so there is a lot that is missing here. But the graffiti in the blocks immediately below are very faint, very small, mostly just individual scattered signs, nothing coherent that we can identify. So he does stand out a bit. He is a bit sort of isolated. And as I said before, he's big. The signs are almost 10 centimeters in height. Let's just zoom in and take a look. The scribal title is very clear and gives you a sense of how deeply carved his inscription originally was. And the erasure is systematic and careful as well, removing individual signs. So you can actually determine at least their shape, and we can kind of get a sense of what the original inscription might have looked like. At the end, quite nicely, you have a little seated man. So the sign that usually closes in a person's name. You can see the little seated man here and the scribal title here. The name mattered in this context, and it was the name that needed to be removed. The title stays. Perhaps it resonated too closely with the eraser's own self-definition. We have a lot of scribes in this area. Perhaps that mattered as well. Umur Hamanshah talks about graffiti performing solidarity, and we see this with Prehotep and his parents, and Ashket and others. But here we have something like the performance of exclusion, of elimination. This intensifies in different ways in the lower courses of the wall. This is a very old photograph of me, but at least it gives you a sense of human scale in relation to this material. And to the sides of me, on either side, you might see a little graffito there, and all along here are extensive graffiti, including these scenes and other scribbles immediately below. Along these sections, so running right along here, we have dense clusters of graffiti. This area begins to look like what Chloe Ragazzoli has called a theatre of inscription. But there are also lots of palimpsests and erasures here that disrupt and disconnect relations and generate new ones. I'll quickly show you our nightmare block, just so you get a sense of how crazy this can be sometimes. This is the block that we are dreading hitting in a couple of weeks with our close work. Graffiti tend to respect other graffiti if they're not erasing it entirely. So the graffiti writers at the bottom of this block, this guy here and a Amenemhab here, have found themselves spaces where they can write without getting engaged in this craziness in here. But in the center of the block, we have graffiti overlaying other graffiti. This graffito here is definitely on top of a graffito that is coming this way. You have this massive deep one overlying smaller graffiti around here. So you do have this palimpsest, this graffito upon graffito upon graffito, at least 2 layers in some cases on this block. I wonder how much palimpsest is different in quality from the other erasures we've seen. You're not removing the earlier graffito, you're just putting yourself literally against it. This place matters, and you can embed your name in it and be amongst these people. There's this and me impetus that Michael McDonald has so beautifully discussed. This is such a communal, busy space where you can see and be seen, and it's also very, very noisy. It's a really noisy section of wall, not just for us trying to unpack it all, but it does seem to have this kind of this chatter about it, all these dialogues of different graffiti. And then there's these scenes that overlay graffiti. They are formal and institutional. They look commissioned. They're relatively nicely carved, but they are not royal. Do the scenes regulate this area in some way? Were graffiti always devotional to some extent, performing acts of belonging to the gods as much as to your human group? Do the scenes intensify and regularize that? In carving these scenes, graffiti were erased. You can just see traces of them. And you can see where the surface of the wall has been prepared right down and erased right down, I think, to take down the wall surface in preparation for these scenes. Does some of the efficacy of these scenes derive from the original graffiti, from the fact that this was a graffitied space? Or does its efficacy derive in part from the graffiti that end up coming back around it? Using reflectance transformation imaging and other photographic techniques, we can start to really analyze the wall surface and really try to look at relative chronologies for the different interventions on the wall. And this is just one example of this corner here. Sorry, the screenshots of the RTI are maybe not super clear, but it does allow us to kind of create 3D models of surfaces to look at the wall surface in different lights. And we have this area here. So the wall surface gets taken down and the scene gets put in. And then this guy comes along and writes his name. And we have, and me, and me. And there would have been someone here as well, and me too, but not any longer. So we have something like an institutional erasure of this wall or a group erasure of this wall to regularize it, to ritualize it in some way, and then more graffiti, and then an erasure that looks more personal again, something like the erasure on block 4. I'm very conscious that in all of the storytelling that you've allowed me to indulge in the last 45 minutes, that I'm running the risk of overinterpretation, I can't say it, apophenia, seeing patterns where there aren't any, seeing conspiracies with this guy where maybe there aren't any. That is, of course, the risk we all run with such fragmentary, and in our case, often minute archaeological data. We can maybe use a bit of the discussion time to push at these stories and maybe explore others. Temple walls, especially in massive state-sponsored complexes like this, are exclusive and excluding. You offer a bribe, you get busted down to being a field laborer, and you will never step foot in this temple again. But we've seen other walls. These walls can be protective, comfortable to lean against, write upon. These are walls that can be, for insiders, collective, communal, but they are consistently marginal. Even Ashaket inscribes into a marginal area, albeit of a centrally significant wall. This in-between and transient status is defining for these walls and the graffiti practices on them. In graffiti studies, we often discuss how this transience is in itself creative of these graffiti clusters and graffiti dialogues. We assess relative chronologies to develop hierarchies, posit relationships, build up whole networks and communities. Instances of erasure are just one way to index the particular instability and vulnerability of all of this. But they also show, I think, how much these walls matter. They matter enough to want to belong to them, of course, and enough for others to decide, for whatever reason, that you no longer belong. Thank you.